Lotus actually grow in the mucky clay soils at the bottom of a pond. So one of the first things that you'll need if you're going to pot up a lotus is some clay soil, and luckily we have a lot of that here in Oklahoma. The other thing that you'll need is a round container, and the size will vary depending on the type of lotus that you're getting. If you're getting a standard large lotus, you'll need one about the size of a whiskey barrel. If you've got a mini lotus, a container that's about 12 inches across is fine, and it needs to be a round container so that the lotus can grow around. You'll also need a lotus tuber and some plant tabs to fertilize because they are fairly heavy feeders. Now, we've actually got a dwarf lotus that we're going to pot up today, so we're using a small container, and they actually like an area with at least 6 hours of sun a day and still water, and that makes them ideal for putting in a container to set on your patio. You can also just pot them up in a round container and lower them into your pond if you have a garden pond. So what we're going to do to start with is just put our soil in the bottom of our container, and about 4 inches deep is good. And I'll just kind of pour it in here and keep track of how much soil you're putting in, because when you fertilize it with about 1 tablet per gallon of soil. So you need to keep track of how much soil goes in so you'll know how much to fertilize it. Now I'm going to just kind of spread this out and then firm it down just a bit and get it ready to plant my lotus and get a little bit of the air out here. And next, I'm going to take my lotus tuber. A lot of people call these bananas, and you can see why here because they have a banana shape. Now there are some important things to remember when you're planting a lotus, and one of the main things to remember is not to damage the growing tip. Now here we've got 3 growing tips, and you can see this one. You want to be very careful and be sure not to damage that, because if you damage that, it won't grow and you won't have success with your lotus. Now this is actually the first leaf. This will be a floater leaf. All the rest of the leaves that come up will be held up above the water, as is the blossom on the lotus. Now this actually, as you can see, kind of curves around, and so I'm going to place this in my pot so that it curves with the pot so that my growing tip has a place to go. If I were to place this in the middle, it would actually come here and it wouldn't know where to go. So I want to do this so it'll spiral around, and I'm going to dig out a depression in my soil here to place my lotus. Now it's very important that you don't cover the growing tips with soil. So if I've got a tip that's kind of going down like this one on this side, I want to dig out more of a depression so that that's not covered with soil. Now I've also got one here I'm going to dig out. And I'm just going to place my lotus kind of on the top of the soil. You may have to work with this a little bit. And again, you want to be very careful with the tips. Now I'm just going to fill in around that with soil, making sure that I've got some soil here, but again, not where that growing tip is. Okay. Now on this one, have to be kind of careful here that we don't injure it. I'll kind of fill in. Now lotus, as you can see here, they look a little bit bulbous. So what I'm going to do after I fill in with my soil here is put a flat rock on top, again being sure not to get it on top of that growing tip so that it won't float up out of that soil in the bottom. Now this one in the middle, having a little bit of trouble. I may end up sacrificing that one, but I've got 2. And if you're looking for a lotus tuber, you need to have at least 2 growing tips on it. So if you injure one, you still got a chance to get a good lotus out of that. There we go. Now I'm going to put a couple of plant tabs because again I had 2 gallons of soil in here, and I'm going to set them out here so the lotus has to search for them. That'll help it to start growing. And then I'm going to cover it with water. Now put your water in a separate container. Now I need to put another rock over here on this side, just in case. Instead of just watering out of the hose, because if you put it in the hose, from the hose, it'll actually wash the soil up out of there and you might cover up those growing tips. Now I'm just going to cover this with about 1 inch of water, and then as the lotus starts to grow, I can add more water. Now for a small lotus, about 4 to 6 inches of water is plenty, and for a larger lotus, about 10 inches of water is plenty. So this makes them very ideal for a patio type setting. Now I would like to thank Victoria Gonzalez-Frank for donating our lotus tubers to us, and we'll have to come back later in the season and see how they're growing.
We hope you've enjoyed this classic from the Oklahoma Gardening Vault. Remember, even though these tips and techniques are timeless, there's always something new to learn in the world of gardening. By subscribing to both Oklahoma Gardening and OK Gardening Classics, you'll have access to a wealth of gardening knowledge, both classic and contemporary.